Good morning, everyone. My name is Savannah Miller, and it's my pleasure to offer you a final briefing on the Safeguarding America's Future and Environment Act, or the SAFE Act in Senate Bill 1601 and House Bill 2804. I'd like to thank my entire team for your hard work and dedication this summer, as well as my task members, Tiffany Sealer, Nina Georgis, and Shira Yashve, as well as our summer's faculty advisor, Professor Robert Cook. So this morning, we'll be discussing an overview of the scientific problems that predicate the SAFE Act, as well as an overview of the legislation at hand. I will then complement this with a case study of the salmon in the Upper Quinault River in the state of Washington, as well as the SAFE solution, and then some measures of success and overarching scientific controversies to keep in mind as we move forward. The problem at hand is that because of climate change, some species of fish, wildlife, and plants can no longer adapt quickly enough to their changing environmental conditions, and thus are at risk of extinction. This picture depicts salmon die-offs, and salmon are a major ecological, cultural, and economic national resource, and their populations are dwindling due to climate change. The ultimate outcome of the SAFE Act is to create a national framework to ensure governmental efficiency in assisting and helping vulnerable species adapt to climate change and extreme weather in order to ensure both their survival and the survival of the ecosystem services they provide. And why? Because strong fish, wildlife, and plant populations provide biodiversity within our nation, with biodiversity defined as the existence of many kinds of fish, wildlife, and plant populations. Biodiversity allows the sustainability of the ecosystem services we enjoy and depend upon, such as crop pollination and soil and air purification. Biodiversity also ensures the vitality of our ecosystem resiliency, meaning the ability of an ecosystem to both withstand and recover from environmental disturbances, such as climate change. And how does the SAFE Act intend to achieve this? To quote the Act itself currently, by protecting, managing, and conserving healthy, diverse, and productive fish, wildlife, and plant populations. So to unpack this, I would now like to introduce an active case study within the SAFE Act's National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, which is the salmon in the Upper Quinault River in the state of Washington. The National Wildlife Federation recently coined salmon as the canary in the coal mine for climate change. This is due to their migration patterns, which expose them to highly variable environmental conditions from freshwater streams to the open Pacific Ocean, and thus many different climate impacts. I've listed a few of many, but to dive further, loss of snowpack. Loss of snowpack leads to more variable stream flows in the summer and fall seasons, and variable stream flows mean lessened stream volume. Lessened stream volume can lead to warmer waters, an impact in their own right due to increasing global temperatures due to climate change. Warmer waters add stress to salmon populations, and under this stress, they're more vulnerable to predators, parasites, and disease, and massive salmon die-offs have occurred at or above 71 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. And in addition, more severe storms and floods are associated with climate change, as discussed in the Strong Act, and they can wash both salmon eggs out of the stream and wash more toxic materials into the streams. And of course, as salmon die, so too do the predators that depend on them as a food source. Salmon are an integral component of their larger ecosystem and thus coined a keystone species. The SAFE Act intends to solve this problem through multilateral, multi-institutional collaboration in order to inform local adaptation plans. Firstly, the President will establish the Joint Implementation Working Group 1 year after the establishment of the SAFE Act. The working group will comprise the heads of federal agencies that have jurisdiction over fish, wildlife, and plant population. This includes, but is not limited to, the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, the United States Geologic Survey, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The working group's task will be to review and revise the national strategy, which I'll explain in more detail momentarily. The working group will be advised by the Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Sciences, as well as the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. The advisory committee will offer a multi-stakeholder perspective and will be comprised of experts in the field of biology, ecology, and climate change, amongst others, and will be represented by the public sector, private sector, and other non-governmental organizations. And the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center will be headed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and will provide an informational hub to inform both the working group and conservation managers on the ground through authorized research. So with these institutions in place, they will enact the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy within 1 year. And then again, within 1 year, this national strategy will inform the creation of state plans. States will then submit these plans to the Department of Commerce and Department of Interior in order to receive funding for their own local adaptation plans and programs. With an emphasis that all of this is under review and revision and that these are living documents, local adaptation plans and programs will be under the same protocol and be expected to be reviewed, revised, and resubmitted every 4 years. So let's take a look at the SAFE Act in action through our case study of the salmon in the Upper Quinault River. Within this specific local adaptation plan in the state of Washington, the overarching goal is localized salmon population within an ecosystem that hosts self-sustainability. In order to achieve this broader goal, conservation managers will enact interim strategies under specific time periods, and this one being the installation of engineered log jams. Installed engineered log jams are a common restoration practice for salmon population because they break up the stream flows, ease erosion, and provide a safe refuge for salmon during streamflow variability and during predator presence. And since 2007, conservation managers have already installed 27 of such. And in order to measure the success of this interim strategy, they will be monitoring under specific time periods population numbers such as birth rate and death rate, water levels, and migration patterns. And now I'd like to transition from the quantifiable indicators of a local adaptation plan to the SAFE Act legislation as a whole. And due to the inherent individuality of each state's conservation concerns and strategies, I would like to divide the SAFE Act's measures of success into two broad categories: process evaluations and outcome evaluations. Under our process evaluations, we'll be assessing at the macro level, and we'll be assessing the efficacy of intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder collaboration in order to further the national strategy. This will include numbers of meetings, deliverables developed during these meetings, and analyses of budgetary expenditures within specific time periods. And of course, in order to effectively monitor the SAFE Act on the ground in conserving, managing, and protecting fish, wildlife, and plant species, we'll also be assessing at the micro level within our outcome evaluations. And as discussed in our case study, the implementation of interim strategies in order to reach larger goals, monitoring and assessing through variables, and then analyses of these variables in order to review, revise, and potentially modify future conservation activities. And of course, as we discuss the SAFE Act's overarching objective in order to respond to climate change with governmental efficiency, it's important to keep in mind some scientific controversies that do remain. The first is in the determination of adaptation rates for these local adaptation plans. Conservation managers need to remain transparent in how they are accurately determining the vulnerability of their own state species because, leading to my next point, there is currently no national standard for identifying vulnerable species. And then thirdly, in the formulation of their local adaptation plans, conservation managers need to be wary of biases, ecological, economical, and cultural, in deciding which species or ecosystems to focus their grant money on. And lastly, again in our formulation of our adaptation plans, conservation managers need to ask, how far is too far in recreating an ecosystem? And putting grant money into these systems, there is the inherent possibility of putting an ecosystem on life support. So to say that it will need indefinite grants, time, and energy in order for it to sustain and thus never reach self-sustainability. Now, although these scientific controversies are crucial in the review and revision of the SAFE Act, they in no way, shape, or form undermine the SAFE Act's overarching objective. There is scientific certainty and a sense of urgency in climate change and its negative impacts to our biodiversity, and thus the ecosystem services we enjoy and depend upon. So we need to remember these scientific controversies in our revision, but the SAFE Act's overarching goal is still present in safeguarding America's future and environment through the protection, conservation, and management of our nation's fish, wildlife, and plant species. Thank you so much for your time this morning. And I'd now like to open the floor to questions if you have any.
Hi. Hey, Savannah.
Hey.
Thanks for the presentation. When you mention species, some of these species could face threats from international or other boundaries, such as like migrating species. Mm-hmm. Does the bill mention any action to take seeking, say, international cooperation to deal with these species?
No, it focuses on a national framework for the conservation of species, although other legislation such as CITES and other other international organizations do focus on that. But this is mainly to ensure governmental efficiency in the management of our own nation's conservation issues.
Great presentation, Savannah. So in your presentation, you had mentioned that salmon was a great American resource, which I would agree it is. Will this act target species with the most human utility for conservation, or does it not make that distinction?
Thank you for bringing that up, Brian, because that harks back to my scientific controversy that there is inherent bias in choosing which species to focus grant money on. The national strategy hopes to encompass all species that provide both human value as well as ecological value. And it currently does not state a balance between human utility as well as ecological and larger utility.
Great presentation, Savannah.
Thank you.
I want to know a little bit about like the cost behind maintaining these ecosystems for salmon and other wildlife. Is it different, if you're using certain mechanisms or certain methods to sort of mediate the situation, or is it overall like a general cost?
It varies. And you can have both passive and active restoration tools. As we learned in our field trips to Randall's Park, you can both have more human action and anthropogenic input in order, and that will cost some money. And there's also more passive restoration that kind of leaves the ecosystem to itself in order to increase its resiliency. And it really depends, and there's inherent individuality in each state's own concerns, but there is funding appropriated through the United States Fish and Wildlife Service that will provide the grants necessary in order to meet each of these individual goals.
Thanks, Savannah.
Mm-hmm.
Again, great presentation. I had a question about your case study and the salmon. In the case of salmon specifically, I don't know about that river specifically, but dams are often a very large threat. And so your working group, you mentioned federal experts coming together, scientific experts coming together. I can imagine some systems where there might be utilities or private industry that makes the system resistant to these kind of restorative changes that your bill wants to make. So is there any effort to bring those private parties into this stakeholder working group in this solution process?
Yes, there is, and the bill actually states that within the working group they will review and analyze either private pursuits or other legislation that may negatively impact their own goals and initiatives, and that would be a great example.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.